there is one question that changes everything. When Saul hurled that spear at David, did he miss because of poor aim, or because the biblical story could not afford for him to hit his target? Because if David had died that night, Israel would have lost its greatest king before he ever reached the throne. Jerusalem would never have become the capital of the kingdom. The promises made concerning the house of David would have been left hanging, and the messianic bloodline that, according to the biblical narrative, would eventually lead to Jesus would have vanished before it even began. And this is where everything changes, because this would no longer be the story of a jealous king trying to eliminate a political rival. It would become the story of a single spear capable of altering 3,000 years of religion, culture, and geopolitics. Welcome to Biblioverse, where we explore alternate biblical universes. This is, what if Saul had killed David with a spear? If we look closely at the original story, it's remarkable how many times David nearly died. Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear. He sent him into battles hoping he would be killed. He hunted him for years through deserts and mountains. On several occasions, the difference between life and death seemed to come down to mere seconds. But there is an even more unsettling question. What would have happened if the very first attempt had succeeded? Imagine the scene. David is playing the harp, trying to soothe the king's troubled spirit. Saul watches the young man everyone is beginning to admire, the boy who defeated Goliath, the military hero who inspired songs, the man of whom the women sang. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. And then it happens. The spear doesn't miss. It doesn't strike the wall. It strikes David, and David dies. No escape, no wilderness, no years on a run, no psalms, no throne. And this is where things begin to spiral out of control. The first consequence would be political. Saul would eliminate the man he considered his greatest threat. For a time, it would seem as though he had regained control of the kingdom. His son Jonathan would lose his closest friend. The army would lose its most beloved hero. But the problem was never merely political. It was spiritual, because God had already rejected Saul as king, and he had already chosen David to replace him, which raises an uncomfortable contradiction. How can the man anointed by God die before fulfilling the very purpose for which he was chosen? And that completely changes this story. Because if David dies, the biblical narrative appears to face a dilemma. Did the divine plan fail? Did God change his mind? Or was there another candidate we were never told about? And then the first possibility emerges. God chooses another king. Perhaps someone else from the tribe of Judah. Perhaps one of David's brothers. After all, the prophet Samuel had been sent to the house of Jesse. But here an enormous problem appears. The later messianic promise wasn't made simply to Judah. It was made specifically to the house of David. And this is where everything changes. Because centuries later, the prophets would begin referring to the future Messiah using a very specific title. Son of David, not son of Jesse, not son of Judah, son of David. Without David, that title disappears. Without David, messianic expectations change dramatically. Then another possibility emerges. Perhaps God rebuilds the plan through a different genealogical line. But if that happened, then this prophecy changes. Because the Davidic covenant promised that one of David's descendants would occupy an eternal throne. That promise became one of the foundations of messianic hope. Remove David before he has children, and you remove one of the most important pillars of later biblical theology. But there is an even more unsettling question. What happens to Jerusalem? Because many people forget that Jerusalem was not originally the capital of the United Kingdom. It was David who conquered the city and transformed it into Israel's political and spiritual center. Without David, the capital might have remained somewhere else. The Ark of the Covenant may never have been brought to Jerusalem in the same way. The symbolism of Zion would be completely different. And that alters centuries of history, because Jerusalem is not important only to Judaism. It also occupies a central place in Christianity and Islam. A decision made in Saul's palace could have redefined the most contested city on earth. And this is where things begin expanding far beyond Israel. Because without David, Many of the psalms traditionally attributed to him would never exist. Think about the impact of that. Some of the most beloved prayers in history would disappear. Psalm 23, Psalm 51, Psalm 27, Psalm 63. Texts that have accompanied people through wars, illness, persecution, and grief. Millions of believers would never have read them. Countless musical compositions would never have been written. Then another unexpected consequence appears. The image of the ideal king changes completely. David embodied a fascinating paradox. He was warrior and poet, king and shepherd, hero and sinner. His life reflected both greatness and failure. That is why later generations used him as a standard by which to evaluate other rulers. Without David, the model of the righteous king would look very different. Perhaps Solomon would never exist, because this connects to something much greater. Without David, there is no Solomon. Without Solomon, there is no first temple as we know it. Without the temple, a huge part of Israel's religious identity changes. The rituals change. The centralization of worship changes. The national story changes. And this is where everything changes, because the impact does not stop in the Old Testament. According to the Gospels, Jesus belongs to the line of David. The genealogies insist on establishing that connection. It is not a minor detail. It is a foundational claim. They present Jesus as the fulfillment of the Davidic promises. But if David dies before starting a family, then an enormous theological crisis emerges. Without Davidic descendants, how would those promises be fulfilled? Would another Messiah have arisen? Would God have chosen a different path? Or would the story of redemption have followed a route impossible to imagine? And here we arrive at the most unsettling conclusion of all. Perhaps Saul's spear was much more than a weapon thrown by a king consumed with jealousy. Perhaps it represented one of the most fragile moments in the entire biblical narrative. Because if it had found its mark, it wouldn't simply have killed a young musician in the royal court. It would have killed a future king. It would have killed a dynasty. It would have killed a genealogy. And with it, some of the most important promises upon which centuries of hope would be built would vanish. But according to the story we know, the spear missed. And David survived, not because he was the strongest, not because he was the fastest, but because, at least within the biblical narrative, there were still too many pages left to be written. Now I want to know what you think. If Saul had killed David with his spear, do you believe God would have raised up another bloodline to fulfill his promises? Or would the course of human history have changed forever? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you're fascinated by discovering how a single decision could have completely transformed the Bible and the history of the world, subscribe to Biblioverse and join us for the next alternate universe. Because one decision, just one decision, can change everything. Until next time,